The Knights of the Cross by Henryk Sienkiewicz. If you really enjoy my work, you can buy me a coffee using the link below the video. Chapter 12. The next day, the court servants began to make preparations in the market square to build the scaffold which was to be erected opposite the principal gate of the city hall. The princess, however, was still consulting with Wojciech Jastrzębiec, Stanislaw of Skarbimierz, and other learned canons who were familiar with the written laws and also with the laws sanctioned by custom. She was encouraged in these efforts by the Castellan's words when he said that if they showed him law or pretext, he would free Zbyszko. Therefore they consulted earnestly to ascertain if there were any law or custom that would do. Although the Shan Stanislaw had prepared Zbyszko for death and administered the last sacraments, he went directly from the prison to the consultation, which lasted almost till daybreak. The day of execution arrived. From early morning, crowds of people had begun to gather on the market square, because the decapitation of a nobleman excited more curiosity than that of a common criminal. The weather was beautiful. News of the youth and great beauty of the sentenced man spread among the women. Therefore the whole road leading to the castle was filled with crowds of townswomen dressed in their best. In the windows on the market square and on the balconies could be seen velvet bonnets, or the fair heads of young girls, ornamented only with wreaths of lilies and roses. The city councillors, although the affair did not belong in their jurisdiction, all appeared in order to show their importance and place themselves near the scaffold. The knights, wishing to show their sympathy for the young man, gathered in great numbers around the elevation. Behind them swarmed the gaily dressed crowd, composed of small merchants and artisans dressed in their guild costumes. Over this compact mass of human heads, one could see the scaffold, which was covered with new broadcloth. On the elevation stood the executioner, a German, with broad shoulders, dressed in a red kubrak, and on his head a cowl of the same color. He carried a heavy two-edged sword. With him were two of his assistants, with naked arms and ropes at their girdles. There were also a block and a coffin covered with broadcloth. In Panna Maria's tower, the bells were ringing, filling the town with metallic sounds and scaring the flocks of doves and jackdaws. The people looked at the scaffold and at the executioner's sword protruding from it and shining in the sun. They also looked at the knights, on whom the burghers always gazed with respect and eagerness. This time it was worthwhile looking at them. The most famous knights were standing round the elevation. They admired the broad shoulders and dark hair, falling in abundant curls of Zawisza Czarny. They admired the short square figure of Zindram of Maszków, as well as the gigantic stature of Paszko Zlodzi of Biskupice, the threatening face of Wojciech of Wodzinek, and the great beauty of Dubko of Olesnica, who at the tournament in Torun had defeated 12 knights. They looked admiringly at Zygmunt of Bobowa, who became equally famous in Košice in a fight with the Hungarians, at Krzon of Koziegloi, at Lis of Targowisko, who was victorious in duels, and at Staszko of Charbimowice, who was able to catch a running horse. General attention was also attracted by the pale face of Mako of Bogdaniec. He was supported by Florian of Korytnica and Marcin of Wrocimowice. It was generally thought that he was the sentenced man's father. But the greatest curiosity was aroused by Pawala of Tczew, who, standing in front, was holding Danusia, dressed in white, with a wreath of green rue resting on her fair hair. The people did not understand what it meant, nor why this young girl was present to look at the execution. Some of them thought she was a sister, others that she was the knight's lady, but none were able to explain the meaning of her dress or of her presence at the scaffold. The sight of her fair face covered with tears aroused commiseration and emotion. The people began to criticize the Castellan's stubbornness and the severity of the laws. Those criticisms gradually changed to threats. Finally, here and there, some voices were heard to say that if the scaffold were destroyed, then the execution would be postponed. The crowd became eager and excited. They said that if the king were present, he would surely pardon the youth. But all became quiet when distant shoutings announced the approach of the king's archers, escorting the prisoner. The procession soon appeared in the market square. It was preceded by a funeral fraternity, the members of which were dressed in long black cloaks and were covered with veils of the same color, which had openings cut for the eyes. The people were afraid of these gloomy figures and became silent. They were followed by a detachment of soldiers, armed with crossbows and dressed in elk-skin jerkins. These were the king's Lithuanian guards. Behind them one could see the halberds of another detachment of soldiers. In the center, between the clerk of the court, who was going to read the sentence, and the Ksiądz Stanislaw of Skarbimierz, who was carrying a crucifix, walked Zbyszko. All eyes now turned toward him, and at all the windows and from all the balconies women's heads protruded. Zbyszko was dressed in his white jaka, embroidered with golden griffins and ornamented with gold galloon. In these magnificent clothes he looked like a young prince or the page of a wealthy court. His broad shoulders and chest and his powerful haunches indicated that he was already a full-grown man, but above that strong figure of a man appeared a childish face with down on the upper lip. It was a beautiful face like that of a king's page, with golden hair cut evenly over the eyebrows and falling on the shoulders. He walked erect, but was very pale. From time to time he looked at the crowd as if he was dreaming. He looked at the church towers, toward the flocks of jackdaws, and at the bells, ringing his last hour. Then his face expressed amazement when he realized that the sobbing of the women and all this solemnity was for him. Finally, he perceived the scaffold and the executioner's red figure standing on it. Then he shivered and made the sign of the cross. The priest gave him the crucifix to kiss. A few steps further, a bouquet of roses thrown by a young girl fell at his feet. Zbyszko stooped, picked up the bouquet, and smiled at the girl, who began to cry. But evidently he thought that, amidst these crowds and in the presence of these women, waving their kerchiefs from the windows, he must die courageously and at least leave behind him the reputation of a brave man. Therefore he strained his courage and will to the utmost. With a sudden movement, he threw his hair back, raised his head still higher, and walked proudly, almost like a conqueror, whom, according to knightly custom, they conduct to get the prize. The procession advanced slowly, because the crowd was dense and unwillingly made way. In vain the Lithuanian guard, marching in front, shouted, "Aik Salin! Aik Salin! Go away!" The people did not wish to understand these words, and surrounded the soldiers more closely. Although about 1/3 of the burghers of Krakow were Germans, still there were heard on all sides threats against the Knights of the Cross. "Shame! Shame! May they perish, those wolves! Must they cut off children's heads for them? Shame on the king and on the kingdom!" The Lithuanians, seeing the resistance, took their crossbows from their shoulders and menaced the crowd, but they did not dare to attack without orders. The captain sent some men to open the way with their halberds, and in that manner they reached the knights standing around the scaffold. They stepped aside without any resistance. The men with halberds entered first and were followed by Zbyszko, accompanied by the priest and the clerk of the court. At that moment something happened which nobody had expected. From among the knights, Pawala stepped forward with Danusia in his arms and shouted, "Stop!" with such a powerful voice that the retinue stopped at once, as if rooted to the ground. Neither the captain nor any of the soldiers dared to oppose the lord and knight, whom they were accustomed to see every day in the castle and often in confidential conversation with the king. Finally, other knights, equally distinguished, also began to shout with commanding voices, "Stop! Stop!" In the meantime, the Pan of Tczew approached Zbyszko and handed Danusia to him. Zbyszko caught her in his arms and pressed her to his chest, bidding her farewell. But Danusia, instead of nestling to him and embracing him, immediately took her white veil from her head and wrapped it around Zbyszko's head and began to cry in her tearful, childish voice, "He is mine! He is mine!" "He is hers!" shouted the powerful voices of the knights. "To the Castellan!" A shout like the roar of thunder answered, "To the Castellan! To the Castellan!" The priest raised his eyes, the clerk looked confused, the captain and his soldiers dropped their arms. Everybody understood what had happened. There was an old Polish and Slavonic custom, as strong as the law, known in Podhal, around Krakow, and even further. If a young girl threw her veil on a man conducted to death, as a sign that she wished to marry him, by so doing she saved his life. The knights, farmers, villagers, and townsmen all knew this custom, and the Germans living in the old cities and towns had heard about it. The old man, Mako, almost fainted with emotion. The knights, having pushed away the guards, surrounded Zbyszko and Danusia. The joyful people shouted again and again, "To the Castellan! To the Castellan!" The crowd moved suddenly, like the waves of the sea. The executioner and his assistants rushed down from the scaffold. Everybody understood that if Zbyszko of Tension resisted the custom, there would be a riot in the city. In fact, the people now rushed to the scaffold. In the twinkling of an eye, they pulled off the cloth and tore it into pieces. Then the beams and planks, pulled by strong arms or cut with axes, began to crack, then a crash, and a few moments later there was not a trace left of the scaffold. Zbyszko, holding Danusia in his arms, was going to the castle, but this time like a true victor, triumphant. With him were marching joyfully the most noted knights in the kingdom. Thousands of men, women, and children were shouting and singing, stretching their arms toward Danusia, and praising the beauty and courage of both. At the windows the townswomen were clasping their hands, and everywhere one could see faces covered with tears of joy. A shower of roses, lilies, ribbons, and even gold rings were thrown to the lucky youth. He, beaming like the sun with his heart full of gratitude, embraced his sweet lady from time to time and sometimes kissed her hands. This sight made the townswomen feel so tender that some of them threw themselves into the arms of their lovers, telling them that if they encountered death, they also would be freed. Zbyszko and Danusia became the beloved children of the knights, burghers, and common people. Mako, whom Florian of Korytnica and Marcin of Rochimowice were assisting to walk, was almost beside himself with joy. He wondered why he had not even thought about this means of assistance. Amidst the general bustle, Powala of Tczew told the knights that this remedy had been discovered by Wojciech Jastrzębiec and Stanislaw of Skarbimierz, both experts in the written laws and customs. The knights were all amazed at its simplicity, saying among themselves that nobody else would have thought about that custom because the city was inhabited by Germans and it had not been used for a long time. Everything, however, still depended on the Castellan. The knights and the people went to the castle, which was occupied by Pan Krakowski during the king's absence. The clerk of the court, the Ksiądz, Stanislaw of Skarbimierz, Zawisza Farurej Zindram of Maszkov and Powala of Tczew, explained to him the power of the custom and reminded him of what he had said himself, that if he found law or pretext, then he would release the prisoner immediately. And could there be any better law than the old custom which had never been abolished? The Pan of Tension answered that this custom applied more to the common people and to robbers than to the nobles, but he knew the law very well and could not deny its validity. Meanwhile, he covered his silvery beard with his hand and smiled, because he was very much pleased. Finally, he went to the low portico, accompanied by Princess Anna Danuta, a few priests, and the knights. Zbyszko, having perceived him, lifted Danusia again. The old Castellan placed his hand on her golden hair, and gravely and benevolently inclined his hoary head. The assembled people understood this sign and shouted so that the walls of the castle were shaken. "May God preserve you! Long life, just Lord! Live and judge us!" Then the people cheered Zbyszko and Danusia when a moment later they both went to the portico, fell at the feet of the good Princess Anna Danuta, who had saved Zbyszko's life, because she, together with the scholars, had found the remedy and had taught Danusia how to act. "Long life to the young couple!" shouted Powala of Tczew. "Long life!" repeated the others. The Castellan, hoary with age, turned toward the princess and said, "Gracious princess, the betrothal must be performed immediately, because the custom requires it." "The betrothal will take place immediately," answered the good lady, whose face was irradiated with joy. "But for the wedding, they must have the consent of Jurand of Spykow." End of part first, part second.
Remember to subscribe.